So it's good to be here today. Again, what I'm going to talk a little bit about is the MRTN database and just our guidelines. And I'm going to kind of walk through some of the things I've been looking at actually over the last few weeks related to the MRTN database. Just to give you a little bit of background, the MRTN database, the recommendations came into play back in 2005. So we're roughly 17 years in terms of this style of recommendation being in place in the state. And we know it's not perfect. One of the main drawbacks that I see is we get a lot of growers asking us for more information related to the for variable rate application. And we know that, with a single rate recommendation, it doesn't really lend itself very well to that type of system. But in terms of where I view it, it does make a good starting point because it's far more defensible than what we had in the past, particularly since this is a data-driven system where we actually have information collected in field from across the state in the database, and that's generating our guidelines. And the nice thing about that, as we go along, particularly as we change hybrids, we change practices, that's all reflected in our data since it is all collected in the field on a yearly basis. So why was it developed? When we started looking back around 2005, there was quite a diversity in the amount of recommendation philosophies across states. The majority of them use some sort of yield goal. One of the things that we hear a lot from growers is that 1.2 times yield goal. And if you look at historically, the University of Minnesota hasn't had that in our guidelines since the 70s. I think it was offered as an option to about the mid 80s, and then we went to a table set of values that still had a yield goal in them, but it was more of a table recommendation and not a straight calculation based on a specific factor. We're getting a lot of flack, particularly for cross state. If you get down to southern Minnesota, the question is, why is the recommendation, if I'm in the lower tier of counties, different when I cross the state line? And that was it's still one of the issues with this type of system with the database. We're getting closer now with some of our numbers, particularly to Iowa, but that was another issue too. That was just cross state programs. It was just hard to justify the differences in the guidelines that were out there. The main issue at that time was the volatility in nitrogen prices, and the same thing that we're seeing now. The reason to develop the maximum return to nitrogen approach really was to look at accounting for some of this price fluctuation in the nitrogen rate guidelines. And that was, I know, one of the things that I remember as I was at Iowa State in 2005, about the time that John Sawyer and Emerson Nafziger were going through and developing this. I remember one of the things they were really focusing on was some of that nitrogen or that price fluctuation. And that when we looked at it too, if you look at over time, we know that corn, the yield has changed. But if you look at it, it's interesting when you look at the overall efficiency, and I don't have it actually in this presentation. If you look at if you grind the grain up and take an analysis of it in terms of the total nitrogen content, one thing that we've seen over time is the amount of nitrogen in the grain has decreased. So we look at that being an indication of overall efficiency, where many of the breeders have bred more starch production into increased yield at the sacrifice of protein. So what we've seen essentially is that the overall demand for corn hasn't necessarily increased, particularly if you look at removal rates over the change in time, where we've seen vast changes in yield responses, where it's still reasonable that while we do see a small amount of creep in the guidelines, that there isn't a very large increase in nitrogen requirement just because of the increase in overall efficiency. So one thing about the MRTN approach is that it is a database-driven approach, so we can call this big data. Essentially, the nice thing I like about it, again, is we're inputting data in, generally trying to do it yearly with looking at just a number of sites, and I'll talk a little bit about kind of our minimum strategy or what we look at for sites before we put it in. Right now, in terms of the overall database across all the Midwestern states that are using that, there's over almost 2,000 individual trials. 100% of them are within 25 years. We look at it, and about 90% are within 15. I'll talk a little bit about this because that's one of the things about this type of approach, is that we can weed data out, particularly sites that we no longer feel are adequate in terms of representing current situations. And I've done this, particularly with continuous corn. We look at the data, and I'll show some of this. seeing some significant differences if you go back to 1990 versus now in terms of the overall yield levels in the economic optimum nitrogen rates as well. And looking at it again, this really gives us an analytical predictive model to determine economic response. If you go to the online calculator too, what you can do is you can look at different price scenarios. If you have different sources of nitrogen you want to price out and see how it would affect things, you can play around with looking at a few different factors and just trying to get a better handle on what's the best option for your particular situation just based on current prices. And again, the big thing about this is that current data equals the guidelines. And we've seen that particularly with the time when Fabian started here at the University of Minnesota. We've started to input more data on a yearly basis into the recommendations. And again, that as we do that more, we're more reflective of current conditions than we would be if we were only putting 1 or 2 sites in per year. So if you look at the components of the database right now, a lot of people think that there's actual yield data in this database, and there really isn't. What the database generally has in there is a set of equations that are representative of the response to nitrogen at a given location. The database itself, you can pull a few things out, maximum N rate applied. We do need to know that. That's one of the things that when I'm looking at data, and it's been a challenge as of late with some of the wet conditions we had, is if you look at some of our response models, is that there's situations where we don't even maximize yield at our maximum rates. And that's one of the things that I really have to look through and look at, seeing if there's a reason for that, or do we include that data or we not? But it's one of the things that has to be included in this. The grain yield at 0 N applied, I'm going to talk about this towards the end. Kind of some interesting, kind of mining some data out of that. I do look at that every once in a while just to see kind of where our yield with no N is. Again, the regression model parameters, a few other things, grain yield maximum N, economic optimum N rate. So there's a few things in it, but again, there's no actual data in there. So you're not going to go in and find actual yield data per every N rate applied. We do have a few things that designate the locations, but in general, it's just a minimum amount of data to essentially make the database run, or to be able to run the database and to be able to partition the database out into different categories based on where we're at within the state. So this are the minimums when we look at our nitrogen response trial requirements, 3 to 4 replications. With my on-farm data, just to keep the size of the studies down, I'll err towards 3 replications, but 4 or more are typically common when it comes to a lot of our smaller plot studies. 5 to 7 nitrogen rates, and it's really important, the more rates you have, the better the ability you have to determine what that optimal level is. So we can do it particularly with a quadratic response with down to about 4 rates, but generally, if I'm looking at a lot of my studies, if I'm trying to develop a curve, minimum, 5, it's generally 6 rates that we're looking at. That gives us a nice range in rates, where I'd like to have 1 year what I would estimate my optimal N rate in that field would be, have a control with no nitrogen, then have at least 2 above and 2 below that. So that about 6 rates is a good minimum just to get us a curve developed. Right now in the Minnesota database, we do not have the irrigated sites. We're looking at adding some of that. And this is the online calculator, because we did use or developed a small database with the irrigated sites back in 2015 when the recommendations were changed. One of the assumptions in 2005 when the database or the system was set up was that our irrigated corn would behave similarly to our high yield non-irrigated corn, and that was a bad assumption just based on the data. Looking at the numbers and looking at what we've got a substantial amount of evidence that we need more nitrogen for irrigated corn, particularly for continuous corn. So the reason that hasn't been added, if you look at the online calculator, I didn't feel we had a critical mass in the number of sites. That was, we were talking about 6-7 years ago. We'll look at then, I think, compiling some of that here to see if we can start adding that, because there's some updates coming with the calculator, the online calculator coming out within the next year or so. Right now, all we have is corn following soybean and corn following corn, and this is represented with the majority of the state. The thing I'll say, if you're in the Red River Valley, the numbers we have are likely going to be high. Looking at the majority of the other locations, we see a fair amount of consistency in kind of where the numbers fall in line with our MRTN value. And I've done this to look at partitioning the data set out, and I'll show you some of that data where we look at, the easiest thing is looking at loess versus till soils, or silt loams in the southeast versus heavier clay soils. And I have some numbers. I'm going to show you that here before we're finished with this presentation. And then again, each state then has the responsibility to come up with the equation. There's a little bit of an art to that. And that's one of the things that we do spend a little bit of time on trying to figure out what's the best fit for the data, because it isn't always clear cut. And it does make a big difference just based on how we fit that model to where that optimal N rate will occur. So again, it's not just inputting the data in and just dumping it all in and leaving it. There's a process to go about this in terms of making sure that the data is good and that we don't need to do any changes within the data set, dropping a site in or out just based on how the model fits with that data. So right now, metadata. So we do have, again, a few pieces of data that are in that state, within state geographic region. Again, right now, Minnesota, we don't have that. If we would get a Northwest data set in there, I'd likely have that in there. What we'd see likely different in Minnesota right now is irrigated and non-irrigated. That's kind of what we're working towards, but we're still a little ways out on getting that. The publication, though, in 2015, it is fairly accurate just based on our current information. So that's why I haven't really moved on it, but we do need to look at that, particularly the sandy soils, irrigated and potentially non-irrigated, depending on how much information we have, and see if some of that needs to be added. Soil yield potential is there. The thing you'll find about a lot of this, so it's always medium high, or actually high, very high, generally is what the soil yield potential is. So that's why I don't use it generally, because we know that, even you look at sandy soils, we know that with the low organic matter situation, that if they're irrigated, they're very high yield potential. So while this is interesting, I've tried to use, again, and I'll show the data looking at parent material just to see, because I wanted to see whether or not we need to regionalize the recommendations, looking specifically at situations like in the Southeast where we have silt loams, where in the past we've seen these soils mineralize more nitrogen, and we always assume they required less nitrogen. So it's kind of one of the things that I've been trying to tease out of this data set, just to see what we have. So again, irrigation is not included, but that's kind of one of the future things. So this is kind of what I do over the winter. I'll start compiling the data sets once we start getting a lot of our trials back. I usually start this year. I started after the 1st of January, just to start seeing what we had. So contacting all the researchers, seeing who has data that fits the minimum requirements. So again, at least 5 nitrogen rates, 3 to 4 reps. And a lot of times too, I'll look at situations, or we'll look at their maximum rate applied, just to make sure that we're not getting into a linear response just because there wasn't a substantial enough rate applied to achieve maximum within the field. We'll fit the curves, observe the shape of the curves. I mean, I'll look at that and just see kind of, do they fit, do they not? Do we have outliers? Do I need to do some cleaning? This is more important with a lot of my on-farm data. We are working with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture on one of their NMI programs, what they call this level 2 program, which are actual nitrogen response curves that we put out. Similar to what Matt was talking, we use grower equipment to put them out within fields, but unlike his trial, we're looking at 6 rates. So we're trying to really tease out what the optimal rate is versus just looking at more of a trial plus or minus what the rate they're applying. So we're trying to get more data to add into the database that's on farm, that's away from some of our experiment stations. Then compile everything into set equations for corn, soybean. So that just shows you kind of the steps in the MRTN calculation. This just shows you a quadratic plateau model. These are pretty common for the majority of our sites. The last few years, though, we've seen what we call more of a linear plateau. So it's a steady increase to a maximum within many of our sites. And it does affect slightly what we see for the MRTNs being calculated. Generally, though, if we see something like this, this rise to a maximum, it's generally a good fit, and it does well in terms of incorporating, makes it a lot easier for developing the MRTN values. So this kind of shows the red dot is what we call the economic optimum nitrogen rate within the individual field. The response curve, what the grain yields are, and then the ABCs that's kind of what we see at the bottom there. That's the equation that's input within the graph itself. So looking at it again, it's somewhat of an art. There's not an exact science to this. I mean, we have to kind of look at the data, and some of it doesn't get added, some of it does. It just kind of depends on some of these given factors. And a lot of times it's whether or not we're deeming these sites, there was some issue that we had, whether it was a application practice that wasn't ideal, or something that was resulting us into a higher requirement of nitrogen at that given location. And this is what you generally get. I mean, this is actually the Iowa database. I use this because we had this graph from John Sawyer. If I would use our database, it'd look a lot of the same. So this is just looking at individual response curves, the number of curves. This is 228 trials. Essentially what it's doing with the database is it's generating data based on each one of these individual curves. It isn't using an average MRTN across the site. It's using all these curve data, and then it's generating the equations, generating it based on individual calculations that are compiled together for all the individual sites. You'll kind of see it generally, you'll see some differences in the sites, but in general, you'll see they all follow somewhat the same pattern, regardless of what the maximum yield level is within a given location. So again, those calculations, it'll calculate every pound. What I work with is an Excel file. So what you have is where it calculates a return for every pound of N applied up to a certain point, and then it's separated out. I've got different tabs for the corn, and the corn, soybean. I've been playing around a little bit with this, and I'll show some of that data, looking again at some of these factors. We're looking at soil type and parent material. I can kind of do some of that once we start getting everything input into the database, and looking at weeding trials in and out just to see how that affects our overall maximum return to nitrogen across the sites we have. So the N rate with the largest average return to nitrogen is the MRTN rate. A lot of times you'll see economic optimum nitrogen rate. We'll talk about MRTN value. They're roughly the same in terms of that. The MRTN value, those kind of that overall encompassing value across all economic optimum nitrogen rates within all of the sites. The profitable range you'll see is then it'll be plus or minus $1 from that maximum return to nitrogen. And what I generally have been using the profitable range is to look at soil productivity. It's one of the reasons why, if you look at our recommendations in the past, we've had recommendations for what we called medium productivity soils. What I saw in a lot of that data, one is we didn't have a lot of that flagged within our database as medium, so I couldn't really go out and separate some of those soils. But if you looked at the recommendations, a lot of the recommendations that were coming were fitting towards the lower end of that profitability range. So the thing about the profitability range, or that plus or minus $1, it gives some flexibility in terms of where you're close to the optimal nitrogen rate. But if you're looking at making adjustments, it's really the best option we have right now, because again, there isn't clear guidance on this in terms of what to do for variable rate application. It's one of the options there, but it's one of the things, at least with producers, with an option if they want to look at in terms of what's pretty close to that maximum rate, plus or minus $1. If they're not willing to invest a high rate, it gives some at least some guides in terms of what the minimal rate that would be suggested, just based on what a producer wants to do. And that's kind of what this these pink bars represent. So that's that profitable range plus or minus $1. And you can see here, if you look at that red curve, which is our net return curve, the blue is our yield return curve, and then the dash green is the fertilizer cost. This is a general output that the calculator online is going to give you. And then you have that plus or minus $1, where we're at a flat part of the curve where we're near maximum, but we're kind of in what's called a flat payoff function near the top of the curve, where it's pretty close, and it gives where we feel it's justified within that range for most applications that a grower is going to make within a given field. One of the other things, again, like I was stating before, if you go online, you can play around with price ratios. This just kind of demonstrates how that changes our response model. You can kind of see as we increase or decrease the price ratio, it changes our overall return to nitrogen. And what the price ratio is, if you take the value per pound of N and divide it by your grain price, that's what the price ratio is. And typically for planting purposes, we see that most fertilizer tends to maintain somewhere around a 0.1 price ratio. That's not going to be the case this spring, when we see closer probably to 0.15 price ratio, just where prices were in the fall and versus where we're kind of looking at them within the spring. And it does change things fairly significantly, where we see essentially that range, that plus or minus $1, will tend to shrink. And then we see that MRTN value move to the left, becoming less recommended N, just adjusting for the fact that the price of nitrogen is more relative to the value of corn. So we're looking at here, this is actually the Iowa data. I think I've got some of the Minnesota data in here, but again, we're pretty close in terms of what we're seeing right now in terms of the two recommendation systems for this, where you see it generally adjusting down about 10 pounds as we increase our price ratio by about 0.05 with each 0.05 increase in that price ratio over time. That's pretty common for what we see, a little bit maybe narrower towards the bottom, with the higher, more expensive when we get to that 0.2 price ratio. But again, the blue area, that's the most profitable range. Again, giving us some general adjustments just based on the data itself. So currently the calculator as it sits right now for Minnesota, where we're sitting, is 121 sites. I'll show you the new data. I've been working this out. I've got the 2021 data in. For corn, we're dealing with 70 sites. So far fewer corn sites. The majority of these have been collected south of I-94. Dave Franzen, when he redid the recommendations for North Dakota, he did use some of our northern data for that. It's one of the things I've been just encouraging any growers up there, if you want to kind of look at comparisons, look at some of Dave's data and compare it kind of with where we're at. Normally, what I've been suggesting to most growers is for the northern part of the northwest part of Minnesota is to go no higher than the lower end of the range for the 0.1 price ratio, because what we've seen generally is 20, 30 pounds less up in that area. It's been pretty common than what we'd recommend down here. But again, we're just dealing with a lack of sites up there. So one of the issues, it's one of the reasons why we don't have a separate class for that right now. So I've been kind of looking at Dave's data because I know he's got more locations compiled in there than we do, more recent data than what we've collected up in that part of the state. So if you Google corn N rate calculator, you're going to find this. There will likely be a change to the web address at some point. Right now, it's being housed on Iowa State University servers. We've been looking at transitioning that off with retirement of John Sawyer to a private server. So you'll likely see here, maybe within the next year or so, a change to the web address. We'll likely have it forwarded from that address. But what you Google corn N rate calculator, you're generally going to find this. It's going to come to the interface, and you can click on single or multiple price to kind of start, and then it goes into where then selecting your state, corn's corn or corn soybean for Minnesota. Then if you're selecting Minnesota, to look at the data itself. It will give you a few tools if you want to look at risk management. I'll talk about this particularly in this upper right-hand corner here. This is actually showing the optimum N rate versus optimum yield within the given sites. And this is pretty common for what we see as a big cloud in the data. And I'll kind of come back to this because I looked at this with the 2021 data in, looking at kind of how things fall and see if there's any general trends in that data. This is the general output that'll come out just based on what scenario you put in place. This was for nitrogen price of 0.4, the corn price of $4, so price ratio of 0.1, giving you an MRTN rate of 131 with a profitable range of 118 to 144. So with the updates in the data, we're roughly looking at around 10 pounds more with the inclusion of the last. This is through 2018 with the 2019, 20, and 21 data. That's kind of where we're looking at just with the addition of that data. And a lot of that has to do with some of the increases we've seen, basically with the weather conditions we've had and with just the addition of more data. We see particularly Fabian working on nitrogen. We have more people working on nitrogen right now. So it's a lot easier to get more data points in than we had in the past when this was first being developed. And this is a histogram. If you want to look at where you're at in terms of a recommendation or what you're applying, based on the data set, this just gives you a percentage of sites and gives you a range. And this is like 125 to 150, where you see about 22% of the sites. So if you look at about a 130 recommendation for corn, soybean, typically we see roughly around 2/3 of the sites in there should be at or below that recommended value. We do know there's some sites that are above it. And again, these are situations where if you have a reason that you know of that you're likely short on nitrogen, again, you have a starting point with the MRTN and have a reason then if you're looking at adjusting up. And we can't tease everything out of this since, again, there's a limited amount of metadata, but there's a few things that we can look at, and I'll show you some of that. It's actually kind of interesting looking at it, what I've been looking at just to see some of the differences in some of these values. So this is by the numbers with current data. This is just showing you kind of how we compare to other states. The red or the yellow is current. So this is actually what I added in through 2021. So you're looking at 73 continuous corn sites. We had 70 in the last database. The reason we don't have as many of an increase is because I dropped out roughly a dozen through about 1999 with the update. Just looking at the data, and I'll show you some of this, we know that the yield potential was lower back, and we saw about 2000 where we saw a break in the data where we started to see a steady increase on average MRTN, or the economic optimum nitrogen rates for continuous corn. Corn soybean right now, we do go back to 1990, and I'll tell you why here in a moment. We're looking at 184 sites. So we're getting into one of the larger databases for corn, soybean across the state. Current numbers right now, 173 for continuous corn, 142 for corn, soybean. So again, you look at kind of where we're at 3 years ago, we've seen an adjustment up, and a lot of it's these wet years. And again, some of it is to the addition of more sites than we've had in the past. So we're favoring current conditions relative to older conditions, and that's being reflected in that database as we move forward. So that's kind of where we're at. If we look at irrigated sites, we're only looking at roughly around 10 or so. And that's again why I'd kind of like to have at least around 15 locations to 20 before we start looking at importing this database in, before I feel comfortable with some of the recommendations that are being generated. So these are looking at the numbers. I updated this. I presented this back about a month ago. I updated with 2021 data, just looking at yearly trends, looking at what's happening over time. This is just looking at average economic optimum nitrogen rates at the 0.1 price ratio based on year. The bar graphs, this represents this axis here, the right axis on these, which is number of sites. So it gives you an idea how many sites from that year were being added to that database. The thing that we're seeing with the continuous corn data, and why I've omitted data pre-2000, if you look at what happened here right around 2000, everything was, you see a little jumping around, but overall the trend was relatively flat in terms of the economic optimum nitrogen rate. It was, fairly low, fairly flat. Around 2000, then we started to see a jump where there was just a steady increase in the average economic optimum nitrogen rate. The interesting thing, though, is the last 3 years. You look at kind of what's happened here, and we see these, particularly last year, these drier years, we've seen that start to kind of moderate back down. So it's not generally uncommon to see this up and down with these sites. Again, what I'm interested in is the overall trend, though. Is it, trending upwards? Is it remaining relatively flat, or what it's doing? Corn, soybean, we saw just a general jump, and a lot of this was just the addition of more sites. And this is essentially, if you look at it relatively flat to about 2012 or 13, seeing more sites being added, seeing that jumping up, where we're looking again at a small increase in terms of what we'd recommend just by the addition of those sites, and being the fact a lot of those sites were in wet years. We can see these years we're putting in roughly 16 sites per year. So we're getting more corn, soybean data into the database versus corn on an annual basis. So it's kind of nice. I can kind of track this. We saw the same thing last year with corn, soybean. If you look at kind of what that EONR, the average, it trended downward for 2021, just with the drier year. And it's kind of one of the things I was interested in seeing, since we're seeing general increasing trends, if that was just solely related to these wet conditions over time, and what would happen if we got back to a dry year, because it kind of starts raising questions. And in terms of, to me, where we go with the recommendations, and how much data do we take out of these recommendations, because we have to kind of have something that represents more of an average condition, whatever that is, or more normal condition moving forward. So we did see a downward trend. We'll see what happens next year, and I'm kind of interested, particularly with situations where we get higher residual nitrates, will that drive down some of our economic optimum nitrate rates further? But kind of, again, seeing these trends generally increasing for corn, soybean, kind of seeing a blip up and remaining generally flat. I did go through, and one thing with the database, I can go through and mine out different sets of data. So what I've been kind of trying to track over time is looking at different slices of the data set. So going back to 2000, then going back to 2011, and just looking at how that changes our economic optimum nitrogen rates. And the biggest difference that we see with this change is with the with continuous corn. And the proposed new database is this 2000 to 2021 with our economic optimum rate of 172. We look at, though, the last 10 years, we look at a slightly higher number in terms of what we're seeing. And with that downturn, that tick in that data, that's one of the things I wanted to see. If we continue to see that going up, in increasing, that we didn't see that downward tick with that continuous corn data, might have some evidence that we may need to look at omitting more data out at that. But overall, the average seems to be holding. I look at across the locations and across the different soil types, we see pretty consistent data within that continuous corn. So this is the one I've seen more consistently, seeing that an increase in the optimal nitrogen rate would be continuous corn. If you look at different regions of data, if we look at corn, soybean, it's about dead on. And if you go back to 1990, that data, it's going to tell you it's 142. So if I look at 10 years of data, I look at 20 years of data, I look at the full data back to 1990, it all gives me the same answer. So that's why we have more data sets in there, data points in there, that still looking at the being consistent. That older data seems to be relevant within that database. So it's, again, this is kind of one thing I do annually, just to kind of just see how things are moving with that, just to see historically where some of this data fits in, and is it relevant or is it not in terms of predicting nitrogen with current conditions. So general consensus on our current database, again, the yearly trends have been upwards for continuous corn. I cut the 96 to 99 data. I cut out, I think, up to 95. That was back when I updated it in 2015. We just really couldn't handle that anymore. And I think with the current hybrids and what we're getting for yields now for continuous corn, it made sense just to take some of that out, particularly it's at the point where we tend to see that general uptick in the optimum nitrogen rate. Really doesn't still account, though. We know there's some sites out there where responses have been higher, and that's where situations like what Matt was talking about, these plus or minus 30 plots, can kind of come into play. So you can kind of see, get to situations where you can test on your farm to see if you're in a situation where you might be in one of these areas, particularly poorly drained soils, where we get these wetter years where it seems like we need an additional, say, 30 pounds of nitrogen within these soils. So it's kind of what we've been looking at right now, is how to handle some of these, because they don't clearly flag out inside of this the database. So kind of what I'm looking at is splitting right now. Do we do that or not? The data really hasn't necessarily panned out where we can put split out poorly drained versus well-drained soils. And part of this I wish we had in the database is we had a situation where we knew more about the tile drainage on these sites. It's one of the things we don't have. We know parent material. We really don't know. Most of these sites are likely going to be tile drained. We just don't know how well drained they are. And as Fabian was talking earlier, I mean, there's a clear difference in terms of drained and undrained in terms of the optimal rates. So really what I'm recommending right now, again, with this is it's a good starting point. But again, if you know you have there's something that may be occurring out there, you have on-farm data that shows you you're plus or minus 30, I think you're justified with that. It's just having a good starting point, and then just having a reason to adjust is really what you want to do. So again, one thing I've been looking at in the database is just looking at parent material. This is looking at luss versus till. So on the left side is luss soils, till soils or high clay soils are on the right, seeing the exact same economic optimum nitrogen rate. And this is one of the things I saw back in 2015. I looked at this back then, it was showing me the same thing. So showing me that I can't split out the southeastern sites versus the south central or the southwestern sites based just solely on parent material. There just isn't enough data on there. We're getting the same N rate. And if you look at in terms of the overall, it's 173. These are 174. So, pretty much the same no matter what. The soybean site did split out slightly. Looking at the economic optimum nitrogen rate in the luss soils being slightly less at 138 versus till 151. So it's one of the things that really the only thing I could pull out of that really was that in terms of some of the heavier soils, maybe needing a slightly higher rate, maybe towards the upper end of the what we'd have for that acceptable range, and the luss soils maybe closer to the lower end if you're dealing with corn following soybeans. So maybe some adjustments looking at that with that. That was the only difference I could pull out within the data set right now. So again, we stress it's a starting point. Should we adjust based on the season? The 2021 data is kind of telling when we see that downtick, and that's what I was kind of curious. We kind of saw that in 2014 where things started to come down again. Wanted to see if we'd see that in 2021 again. If we're getting into more of a dry season. So seeing some of the same things, it kind of then we have to moderate things a little bit in terms of then just saying what's the best starting point and then making adjustments for there. And that's kind of where we're at. And I felt justified just based on what we're seeing, at least with the changes in the database, taking out some of the older data for continuous corn, and then again, leaving the stuff in for corn, soybean. And one of the challenges, it's just impossible to know how much we need within a field within a given year until after the season's over. And that's one of the main challenges with this. I can come tell you what happened during a year after that year's occurred, but for planning purposes, we just need to have a starting point. Again, this seems to be a system that really is a good starting point. Then again, just looking at some different options you have out there for figuring out when or where to make adjustments. So not much I have to say about this. Most other tools, again, are data driven. So everything needs new data. So again, this being a similar approach that we'd have with crop models, so you just continual evaluation of the process. Will a new tool be out there to replace it? Eventually, maybe. It's one of the things that we're always looking at different options, but right now it's been the best in terms of performance that we've seen. For an update right now, we should be releasing something here this spring for this. And in the looking at revising the corn guidelines for Minnesota, we'll mainly see an update, if you will, to be the non-irrigated situations. The irrigated sites, we just do not have enough data at this point to say that we're markedly different, but we will be looking at that here over the spring. So again, getting back to this, I just want to kind of touch a little bit before I end here on this this yield situation, because we still get a lot of flack with this from growers saying, well, I'm raising 250, 260 bushel yield now. I can't believe that I need the same amount of nitrogen I needed 10 years ago. So the bottom graphs are just kind of a resummary of the, if you look at a grain yield at the economic optimum nitrogen rate on the y-axis, on the bottom then is our optimum nitrogen rate. Seeing somewhat of a trend with that, but generally it's a very poor fit. So in terms of overall predictability, we see a lot of noise in this data, not a clear relationship between optimum nitrogen rate and optimum yield. One thing I did work on though is I looked at the percent yield produced by the control as a percent of the maximum yield within individual sites, and seeing a better relationship between those factors and optimal nitrogen rate at those given sites. We can see the more or the greater optimal nitrogen rate, generally the less yield produced by the control. So, you know, we can mine some stuff out of there. I mean, using this, can I use this for a nitrogen rate model? Probably not at this point, because I'm not really going to know where you're going to be at in terms of the overall yield level, but it's kind of reflective of the fact that the soil supply and what's there is likely dictating more of what the optimal nitrogen rate is versus the optimal or the maximum yield potential at a given location. Looking at this a different way, looking at sites for continuous corn, if you'll figure where the check is producing less than 50% of maximum yield, our economic optimum nitrogen rate's closer to 200 pounds versus closer to 140 pounds. We're getting a higher level of nitrogen supplied in that soil itself. So we're producing a higher amount of a yield relative to our maximum yield by the control. So some things we can kind of look at it, but again, you know, really not being able to completely factor that in with some of our guidelines just because of the variability out there. And see the same thing with corn, soybean. You're looking at roughly 40, 50 pound difference between situations where you're dealing with where you're not getting as much potential yield out of that control plot relative to situations where it's a lot higher. And one of the things I can kind of say before I wrap up, I mean, I have had situations where we've gotten extremely high yield, 260, 270 bushel with about 100 pounds of nitrogen. My control yield in some of those locations are over 200 bushels to the acre within that. So there's you know, a vast difference in these particular sites in terms of what they can supply. It just teasing that out and getting a more prescriptive recommendation set of where those might recur has been difficult. So with that, I have some time for some questions. So the first question is, have you considered weighting the value of each trial in the MRTN database based on the confidence interval for the regression model? No, we really haven't. We haven't really gotten into digging into that far. It is amazing to me, though, looking at some of these trials and how much just taking one out can impact some of the results. That last slide before that closing slide, I had some goofy things happening in one of the models where you could see kind of a lot of just fluctuation when we got beyond the MRTN value. And that seemed to be from sites that were highly negative in terms of their return. But it does happen in there that you can take a site in or out of there, and it's amazing how much that can impact things. So that's kind of one of the processes to go through, where it isn't just throw everything in and walk away from it. It's one of the things we have to look at it just to make sure that there's not some issues with that site that are affecting the data. Will there ever be an MRTN model for corn following alfalfa? We haven't really looked at it in terms of the actual recommendation set in the current guidelines for the corn publication does have their MRTN based recommendations, but we just do not have anything on the online calculator right now. And a lot of that is the issue with the number of sites with it. And the data, I worked closely with Jeff Coulter on that for putting some of that together. So, I mean, it does reflect some of that. It's similar to what we did with the irrigated sites, where we use the MRTN to calculate out the rates, but we don't have a set scenario in the online calculator that's bearing that out. But it's something that, again, it's factored in. It's just something that we had to put more in a table value versus splitting that and putting it in our online calculator. Any additional questions?
Any other questions for Dan? All right, let's thank him.